The morning fog hung thick over Monterey Bay as Daniel Chen adjusted his worn fishing nets for what felt like the 1,000th time that month. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the arthritis that had been getting worse each winter. At 42, he looked older than his years, the California sun and salt air having carved deep lines around his eyes. The small fishing boat beneath his feet creaked with every wave, a constant reminder that the Esperanza was barely holding together with duct tape, prayer, and his stubborn refusal to give up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel had been working these waters for 15 years, ever since losing his job at the tech company during the last recession. Back then, he thought it was temporary, just a way to make ends meet while he looked for another engineering position. But life had other plans. His wife, Sarah's cancer diagnosis came 2 years later, followed by medical bills that consumed their savings and forced them to sell their house in San Jose. By the time Sarah passed 3 years ago, fishing wasn't just what Daniel did for work. It was all he had left, the only thing standing between him and complete financial ruin. The radio crackled with the morning weather report, but Daniel barely listened. He knew these waters better than any meteorologist, could read the sky and feel the pressure changes in his bones. Today felt different though, charged with an electricity that made him uneasy. The fog was thicker than usual, and the swells had an odd rhythm that spoke of distant storms brewing far out in the Pacific. His phone buzzed against his hip, a text from his landlord about next month's rent. Daniel deleted it without reading the full message. He knew what it said, the same thing it had said for the past 3 months. Pay up or get out. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days surrounded by million-dollar yachts belonging to Silicon Valley executives while struggling to keep a roof over his own head in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Rodriguez's fish market. The Esperanza coughed to life as Daniel started the engine, its diesel motor protesting but ultimately complying. He'd rebuilt that engine himself twice in the past 5 years, each time wondering if it would be the last. But today, like every day, he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the work ahead. The rockfish had been running well near the kelp beds about 3 miles offshore, and if he was lucky, he might make enough to buy groceries and put a little aside for rent. As he navigated through the harbor, Daniel passed the usual parade of luxury vessels, sleek sailing yachts worth more than most people's houses, motor yachts the size of small apartment buildings, and racing boats that cost more per foot than he made in a year. He'd stopped feeling bitter about the disparity long ago. These boats brought tourists and wealthy visitors to the area, which meant more people eating fish at the local restaurants, which meant more demand for his catch. In a strange way, their excess helped him survive. The fog began to lift as he reached his favorite fishing spot, revealing a morning that promised to be spectacular. The sun painted the water in shades of gold and emerald, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself to appreciate the beauty of his workplace. Not many people got to work in paradise, even if paradise came with a steady diet of uncertainty and financial stress. He had just dropped his lines when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. A mayday call crackling through the marine radio, the voice high-pitched and terrified. "Mayday, mayday, this is the Serenity's dream. We're taking on water fast. 3 children aboard. GPS coordinates." The transmission cut to static. Daniel grabbed his radio, his engineering background kicking in as he calculated distances and drift patterns. The coordinates put the vessel about 2 miles northeast of his position, in an area where the underwater canyon created unpredictable currents. If a boat was sinking, there, especially one with children aboard, time was everything. Without hesitation, he hauled in his lines and gunned the Esperanza's engine. The old boat responded with more speed than it had shown in months, as if it too understood the urgency of the situation. Daniel's mind raced through everything he knew about maritime rescue. He'd never actually performed one, but he'd read the manuals, taken the Coast Guard auxiliary courses, and most importantly, he understood that in an emergency, sometimes an old fishing boat was better than no boat at all. The radio continued to crackle with activity. The Coast Guard was responding, but their nearest vessel was 20 minutes out. Harbor Patrol was mobilizing, but they were dealing with fog delays. Other boats in the area were trying to locate the vessel, but the coordinates given were approximate at best. Daniel punched the numbers into his ancient GPS unit and prayed the Esperanza would hold together long enough to make a difference. As he raced across the swells, Daniel thought about his own daughter Emma, who would be starting college in the fall if he could somehow scrape together the tuition money. The thought of children in danger on the water made his stomach clench. The ocean that provided his livelihood was also an unforgiving mistress that had claimed too many lives over the years. He'd seen what hypothermia could do to a person in these waters, how quickly shock and cold could turn a manageable situation into a tragedy. The fog patches were still thick in some areas, creating an eerie maze of visibility and blindness. Daniel slowed the Esperanza when he entered each fog bank, listening intently for sounds of distress. His 15 years on these waters had taught him to navigate by sound and instinct when visibility failed. The particular way waves broke over different underwater formations, the echo patterns off the coastal cliffs, even the way seabirds called from different areas, all of it formed a three-dimensional map in his mind. Then he saw it, a flash of white through the fog about half a mile ahead. As he got closer, the shape resolved into a luxury yacht, maybe 60 feet long, listing heavily to starboard. Even from a distance, he could see that it was in serious trouble. The bow was riding low, and water was clearly pouring in somewhere below the waterline. On the deck, he could make out small figures waving frantically. Daniel's heart pounded as he approached the sinking vessel. The yacht was magnificent even in distress, the kind of custom-built masterpiece that probably cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But all of that meant nothing now. It was just another boat taking on water, and there were children aboard who needed help. As he drew alongside, he could see 3 kids on the deck, 2 boys who looked to be around 8 and 10, and a girl who couldn't be more than 6. They were wearing life jackets, which was good, but they were clearly terrified. The older boy was trying to comfort the younger ones while scanning the horizon for help. "Hey there," Daniel called out, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of dealing with maritime emergencies and fishing communities. "I'm here to help. Is anyone else on board?" "Just us," the older boy shouted back. "Our mom stayed in the city for meetings. The captain said he felt sick and went below, but that was like an hour ago and he won't answer us." Daniel quickly assessed the situation. The yacht was going down, no question about it. He could see water sloshing across the lower deck, and the list was getting worse by the minute. But the Esperanza was not equipped for a standard rescue. She was a working fishing boat, not a Coast Guard cutter. He'd have to get creative. "Okay, listen to me," he called out, maneuvering his boat as close as he dared. "We're gonna get you off that boat, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" The 3 children nodded, their trust in this stranger both heartbreaking and inspiring. Daniel looked at his own boat, calculating weights and angles. The Esperanza had a working crane that he used for hauling in large catches, but it was meant for fish. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, not people. Still, it might work if he was careful. The yacht lurched suddenly, its bow dipping even lower into the water. Whatever was causing the flooding was getting worse, and they were running out of time. Daniel made a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned but felt absolutely right in his gut. "I'm going to throw you a line," he called out. "The oldest boy, what's your name?" "Marcus." "Marcus, I need you to tie this around your waist, and then I'm going to pull you over to my boat. Then we'll get your brother and sister. Can you swim?" "Yes, sir." Daniel threw a rope across the gap between the boats, his aim perfect from years of practice. Marcus caught it on the first try and began tying it around his waist with the competence of a kid who'd clearly spent time around boats. While he worked, Daniel positioned the Esperanza to account for wind and current drift. "Before we do this," Daniel shouted, "what are your names, all of you?" "I'm Marcus, this is Ethan, and that's Lily," the boy called back, pointing to his siblings. "I'm Daniel. We're gonna be fine, okay? I've been on these waters for 15 years, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The rescue that followed was part seamanship, part engineering improvisation, and part pure determination. Daniel used every trick he'd learned in his years of commercial fishing, treating the children like precious cargo that needed to be transferred safely from one vessel to another. Marcus came across first, Daniel timing the pull to match the rhythm of the swells. The boy hit the water between the boats but came up immediately, and Daniel hauled him aboard with a mechanical winch. Ethan followed, clearly more scared but trusting his older brother's lead. The 8-year-old fought panic as he went into the cold water, but Daniel's steady encouragement and quick work with the winch got him safely aboard the Esperanza within seconds. Lily was the hardest. At 6 years old, she was terrified of leaving the relative safety of the yacht's deck for the unknown terror of the water. But as the boat continued to sink around her, Marcus talked to her from the fishing boat, his voice steady and reassuring. "Remember when we practiced swimming at the club, Lily? This is just like that, except Daniel is going to pull you across like you're a mermaid. You love playing mermaid, right?" The little girl nodded, tears streaming down her face but determination replacing terror. When she jumped, Daniel's heart stopped for a moment as she disappeared beneath the surface. But she came up quickly, gasping but swimming, and he had her aboard in less than 10 seconds. As soon as Lily was safely on the Esperanza, the yacht gave a final lurch and began to go down in earnest. The stern rose into the air, and Daniel could see the name clearly for the first time. Serenity's Dream, San Francisco. Within minutes it was gone, leaving only debris and an oil slick on the surface of the water. The 3 children huddled together on the deck of the fishing boat, wrapped in the emergency blankets Daniel kept in his first aid kit. They were safe, but they were also in shock, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. Daniel grabbed his radio to report the rescue to the Coast Guard, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next problem. These weren't just any kids. Their clothes, their manner of speaking, the yacht they'd been on, everything suggested they came from serious money. And now they were aboard his rusty fishing boat, probably getting their first real look at how the other half lived. Daniel felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. What would their parents think? Would they blame him for not finding them sooner? Would they assume he was somehow responsible for the yacht sinking? Marcus, the oldest boy, seemed to sense Daniel's discomfort. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel replied, checking the blankets around the younger children. "This is what people do on the water. We look out for each other." But even as he said it, Daniel wondered if that was really true anymore. In his experience, the wealthy yacht owners who frequented these waters lived in a different world from commercial fishermen like himself. Their paths crossed in the same waters, but they might as well have been on different planets. The Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon just as Daniel was radiating in his position. Within minutes, the professional rescue crew was alongside the Esperanza, ready to transfer the children to their vessel for medical evaluation and transport back to shore. But Marcus surprised everyone by speaking up. "Can we stay with Daniel until we get back to port?" he asked the Coast Guard officer. "He saved us. We trust him." The officer looked at Daniel with new respect. "Are you comfortable with that, sir? We can have you follow us back to the harbor." Daniel nodded, touched by the children's trust but also aware that this simple rescue was about to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As they headed back toward Monterey, Lily fell asleep against his side, while Marcus and Ethan peppered him with questions about fishing, boat engines, and life on the water. What Daniel didn't know was that the children's mother, Dr. Victoria Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, was at that moment in a boardroom 40 miles away, about to sign a deal that would make her one of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. What he also didn't know was that her children's rescue by a down-on-his-luck fisherman was about to intersect with her world in ways that would transform both their lives forever. The harbor master's office buzzed with activity as Daniel's fishing boat approached the dock. Word of the rescue had spread quickly through the maritime community, and what should have been a routine return to port had turned into something approaching a media circus. Local news crews had already set up cameras, and Daniel could see several official-looking vehicles parked along the waterfront. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he guided the Esperanza into its slip. He'd always preferred to keep a low profile, partly from natural shyness and partly because his financial situation made him sensitive about drawing attention to himself. The last thing he wanted was to become some kind of local celebrity, especially when he knew that scrutiny might reveal just how close to the edge he was living. Marcus noticed Daniel's tension as they tied up to the dock. "You okay, Mr. Daniel? You look worried." "Just not used to all the attention," Daniel admitted, securing the lines with practiced efficiency. "I'm more comfortable when it's just me and the fish." A Coast Guard officer approached as they were preparing to disembark, clipboard in hand and questions ready. Behind him, Daniel could see reporters jockeying for position and officials from what looked like every maritime agency in Central California. "Mr. Chen," the officer began, "I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. We need to debrief you about the rescue, and we'll need statements from the children as well. But first, I want to personally thank you for your quick response. Your actions today saved 3 lives." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. Anyone would have done the same thing. "Actually, sir, that's not true. We had 3 other vessels in the general area, but you were the only one who immediately changed course to respond. And your rescue technique, using fishing equipment to transfer the children, that was resourceful thinking under pressure." As they walked toward the harbor master's office, Daniel noticed how the children stayed close to him, clearly still processing their ordeal. Lily held his hand while Marcus and Ethan flanked him on either side, creating an impromptu family unit that felt both natural and strange. The debriefing took 2 hours. Daniel answered questions about timing, weather conditions, and his decision-making process during the rescue. The children, despite their obvious fatigue, provided clear accounts of what had happened aboard the yacht. According to Marcus, the captain had complained of stomach problems and gone below to rest about an hour before the boat started taking on water. They'd tried to wake him when they noticed the flooding, but he was unresponsive in his cabin. "The water was coming in really fast," Ethan explained to the investigator. "We tried to use the radio like Captain Jim taught us, but we couldn't make it work right." That's when Marcus found the emergency radio and called for help. Lieutenant Rodriguez made notes while Daniel listened, gaining new respect for how well the children had handled the crisis. They'd followed their safety training, stayed calm, and made smart decisions under pressure. Whatever their background, they'd been raised well. As the official questioning wrapped up, a new complication arose. Social services had been called to take custody of the children until their parents could be located and arrive to claim them. The prospect of spending the night in foster care clearly terrified the kids, especially Lily, who had barely spoken since coming ashore. "How long before their parents get here?" Daniel asked the social worker, a kind-faced woman named Janet Morrison. "We're still trying to reach them," Morrison replied. "The yacht was registered to Victoria Chen of Palo Alto, but we haven't been able to make contact yet. Her office says she's in meetings all day and isn't taking calls. We're hoping to reach her by this evening." Daniel looked at the 3 children, who were clearly exhausted and overwhelmed by the bureaucratic machinery grinding into motion around them. Marcus had his arms around his younger siblings, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Is there any way they could stay with me tonight?" Daniel heard himself asking, the words surprising him as much as everyone else. "Just until their mother can get here. They've been through enough trauma for one day." Morrison looked skeptical. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but there are protocols for situations like this. We can't just release rescued children to a stranger, even one who saved their lives." "He's not a stranger," Marcus spoke up firmly. "He saved us. We trust him more than anyone else right now." The room fell silent as everyone processed this statement. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy net. These children had placed their trust in him, and he found himself unwilling to let them down, even if it meant navigating bureaucratic waters he'd never encountered before. Lieutenant Rodriguez intervened. "What if we arranged for Mr. Chen to be an emergency foster placement for tonight? We can expedite the background check, and given the circumstances—" Morrison considered this. "It would be highly irregular. We'd need supervisor approval, a home inspection, and Mr. Chen would need to pass an immediate background screening." Daniel thought about his tiny apartment above the fish market, with its thrift store furniture and bills stacked on the kitchen table. The idea of anyone officially inspecting his living situation made him cringe, but the look in Lily's eyes made the decision for him. "Whatever you need to do," he said. "I'll make it work." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of paperwork, background checks, and hasty preparations. Daniel called Mrs. Rodriguez, his elderly landlady, to explain the situation. To his surprise, she immediately offered to help, bringing up blankets, pillows, and enough food to feed a small army. "Mito," she said in her mixture of Spanish and English that Daniel had grown to love. "These children need family right now. You give them family." By 6 o'clock, Daniel found himself in his small apartment with 3 children who were slowly beginning to relax for the first time all day. He'd given them his bedroom and set up the pull-out couch for himself. Marcus was helping Ethan with a shower while Lily sat at the kitchen table, finally eating something substantial. "Mr. Daniel," she said quietly, looking up from her sandwich, "when will our mom come get us?" "Soon, sweetheart," Daniel replied, though he was beginning to wonder the same thing. Multiple agencies were trying to reach Victoria Chen, but so far their efforts had been unsuccessful. Her office insisted she was in crucial meetings that couldn't be interrupted, and her personal phone seemed to be turned off. As evening fell, Daniel found himself in the strange position of putting 3 traumatized children to bed in his tiny apartment. Marcus, despite his young age, took charge of getting Ethan settled, while Daniel helped Lily brush her teeth with a spare toothbrush Mrs. Rodriguez had provided. "Will you read us a story?" Lily asked as he tucked her into his bed between her brothers. Daniel looked around his sparse bedroom, realizing he didn't own any children's books. But then he remembered something from his own childhood, when his father used to tell him stories about fishing and the sea. "How about I tell you a story instead?" he suggested. About a brave group of sailors who learned to read the ocean like a book. As he spun a tale about courage and adventure on the high seas, Daniel watched the children's eyes grow heavy. They'd been through more in one day than most kids experienced in years, but they were safe now, and that was what mattered. After they fell asleep, Daniel sat in his small living room, drinking coffee and thinking about the day's events. His life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, and he still had no idea what tomorrow would bring. The rescue had cost him a day of fishing income he couldn't afford to lose, and now he was responsible for 3 children whose mother apparently commanded enough respect that government agencies were hesitant to interrupt her meetings. His phone rang at 9:30, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unmistakably worried. "Mr. Chen, this is Victoria Chen. I understand you rescued my children today." Daniel straightened in his chair, suddenly very aware of the coffee stains on his shirt and the stack of unpaid bills visible on his kitchen counter. "Yes, ma'am. They're safe. They're sleeping now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Victoria spoke again, her professional composure had cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry it took me this long to call. I was in negotiations that doesn't matter now. What matters is that my children are safe because of you." "They're brave kids," Daniel said. "They handled themselves really well during the rescue. Where are they staying tonight?" The social worker said something about emergency foster placement, but the details were unclear. Daniel took a deep breath. "They're here with me, in my apartment. I know it's not what they're used to, but—" "Mr. Chen," Victoria interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my children's lives, and then opened your home to them when they needed somewhere safe to sleep. I don't care if you're housing them in a cardboard box. You're a hero." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Victoria asking detailed questions about the rescue and the children's condition. Daniel found himself surprised by her warmth and genuine concern. He'd expected someone cold and corporate, but the woman on the phone sounded like nothing more than a worried mother who was grateful beyond words. "I'm driving down first thing in the morning," Victoria said finally. "I should be there by 10. And Mr. Chen, when this is all over, I'd like to take you to dinner. It's the least I can do." After hanging up, Daniel checked on the children one more time. They were sleeping peacefully, Lily curled up between her brothers like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Looking at them, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond just making ends meet. He had no idea that Victoria Chen was at that moment sitting in her Palo Alto mansion, staring at reports that would make her one of the most powerful people in the technology industry. He didn't know that her crucial meetings had been finalizing a merger that would create a new kind of clean energy consortium worth billions of dollars. And he certainly didn't know that his simple act of human decency was about to intersect with her world in ways that would change both their lives forever. All he knew was that 3 children had needed help, and he'd been able to provide it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, everyone was safe. Outside his window, the lights of Monterey Bay twinkled like stars on the water, and somewhere in the distance, fishing boats were heading out for the night shift. Life on the water continued its ancient rhythm, but for Daniel Chen, everything had changed. He just didn't know how much yet. The morning arrived gray and foggy, typical for Monterey Bay in early summer, but Daniel was already awake and moving around his small kitchen by 6. 15 years of fishing had trained his body to rise before dawn, even when circumstances kept him on land. He'd spent most of the night on the pull-out couch, checking on the children every few hours and marveling at how 3 strangers had transformed his solitary existence overnight. Marcus was the first to wake up, appearing in the kitchen doorway in borrowed pajamas that Mrs. Rodriguez had somehow procured the night before. Despite everything he'd been through, the 10-year-old carried himself with a composure that impressed Daniel. "Good morning," Marcus said politely. "Did our mom call?" "She did," Daniel confirmed, flipping pancakes on his ancient griddle. "She'll be here around 10 to pick you up." "Are you sad that we're leaving?" The question caught Daniel off guard with its directness. Daniel considered his answer carefully. "I'm happy you're going home to your mom where you belong. But I'm going to miss having you guys around. This place has been pretty quiet for a long time." Ethan appeared next, drawn by the smell of pancakes and bacon. At 8 years old, he was more openly emotional than his older brother, and the events of the previous day had clearly affected him deeply. "Mr. Daniel," he said, climbing onto one of the mismatched kitchen chairs, "will we ever see you again after today?" "I hope so," Daniel replied honestly. "Your mom mentioned dinner, so maybe we can work something out." Lily was the last to emerge, still sleepy and clutching a small stuffed animal that Mrs. Rodriguez had brought up the night before. She climbed into Daniel's lap without asking permission, a gesture of trust that made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the children picking at their food despite clearly being hungry. The reality of returning to their normal lives was setting in, and with it came a host of emotions they were too young to fully process. Daniel found himself wishing he knew more about child psychology, wanting to help them work through their trauma, but feeling unqualified for the task. At 9:30, a convoy of expensive cars began arriving outside the fish market. Daniel watched from his window as drivers in suits emerged to open doors for an impressive collection of people. The lead vehicle was a silver Tesla Model S that looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. "That's Mom's car," Marcus said, pressing his face against the glass. "And that's probably Mr. Harrison and the security team." Security team. Daniel felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. What kind of life did these children come from that their mother traveled with security? Victoria Chen stepped out of the Tesla like she was walking onto a movie set. Even from the second-story window, Daniel could see that she commanded attention effortlessly. She was smaller than he'd expected from her phone voice, probably around 5'4", but she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from being used to getting her way. Her dark hair was pulled back in a precise bun, and her business suit was clearly expensive enough to cost more than Daniel made in several months. "She looks serious," Ethan observed nervously. "She looks worried," Daniel corrected gently. That's what parents look like when their children have been in danger. The knock on the door came exactly at 10 o'clock. Daniel opened it to find Victoria Chen standing in his narrow hallway, flanked by 2 men in suits who were clearly security personnel. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd appeared from the window, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mr. Chen," she said, extending her hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. "Victoria Chen, I can't begin to thank you for what you've done." Before Daniel could respond, all 3 children rushed past him to embrace their mother. The transformation in Victoria was immediate and complete. The corporate executive disappeared, replaced by a mother who was clearly fighting back tears as she held her children. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled as she buried her face in Lily's hair. "Are you hurt? I was so scared when I got the message." "We're fine, Mom," Marcus said, his own composure finally cracking. "Daniel saved us. The boat was sinking and he came and got us, and then he let us stay here and made us pancakes and told us stories." Victoria looked up at Daniel over her children's heads, and he could see genuine gratitude mixed with something that might have been curiosity. "May I come in? I'd like to talk with you, if that's all right." Daniel nodded, suddenly aware of his small apartment's shortcomings. The contrast between Victoria's obvious wealth and his modest circumstances was stark. But she didn't seem to notice or care. She settled onto his battered couch as if it were the finest furniture money could buy, keeping Lily on her lap while the boys flanked her on either side. "I want to hear everything," she said, looking between Daniel and her children. "From the beginning?" The story took an hour to tell, with each child adding details and corrections to the others' accounts. Daniel found himself impressed again by how accurately they remembered the sequence of events, and how they worked together to create a complete picture of their ordeal. Victoria listened without interrupting, asking occasional clarifying questions but mostly just absorbing every detail. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. "The captain," she said finally. "Has there been any word about what happened to him?" "The Coast Guard is still investigating," Daniel replied. "They found him in his cabin, unconscious but alive. He's at community hospital under observation. Preliminary reports suggest some kind of medical episode, possibly a stroke or heart attack." Victoria nodded grimly. "Jim's been with our family for 5 years. He's always been completely reliable, which is why I felt comfortable letting the children take the boat out for a day trip. If he had a medical emergency." She trailed off, clearly thinking about how differently things could have ended. Daniel watched her process the near miss, recognizing the particular kind of guilt that came with realizing how close you'd come to losing everything that mattered. "The important thing is that everyone's safe," he said quietly. Victoria looked at him sharply, as if hearing something in his tone that surprised her. "You sound like someone who knows something about loss." Daniel felt heat rise in his neck. "We all have our stories." Before Victoria could respond, one of her security team members appeared in the doorway. "Miss Chen, we need to get moving if you're going to make the afternoon board meeting." Victoria's expression shifted back toward business mode, but she waved him off. "Cancel it. Reschedule everything for tomorrow." The security guard looked surprised. "Ma'am, the Prometheus merger can wait 24 hours. Victoria finished firmly. "My children just survived a near-death experience. Everything else is secondary." Daniel didn't understand the reference to Prometheus, but he could tell it was significant from the way the security guard's eyebrows rose. Victoria turned back to the children, who had been listening to this exchange with interest. "Here's what's going to happen," she told them. "We're going to go home, and you're going to rest and recover from yesterday. Tomorrow we'll talk about counseling and making sure you're processing everything in a healthy way. But first, I want to take Mr. Chen to lunch to properly thank him for what he did." The children perked up immediately. "Can we come too?" Lily asked. "Of course," Victoria smiled. "But let's let Mr. Chen get cleaned up first. We've imposed on his hospitality enough for one day." As the family prepared to leave, Daniel found himself in the strange position of saying goodbye to children who had become important to him in less than 24 hours. Marcus shook his hand solemnly. Ethan gave him an impulsive hug, and Lily made him promise to visit them soon. "We live in Palo Alto," she said seriously. "It's not that far from here." After they left, Daniel stood in his suddenly empty apartment, trying to process what had just happened. The space felt different now, not just quiet, but actively lonely in a way it hadn't been before the children's arrival. He'd forgotten how much energy and life kids could bring to a place, and their absence left him feeling oddly deflated. His phone rang an hour later. Victoria's number appeared on the caller ID, and when he answered, her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there during the more formal moments of their face-to-face meeting. "The children are insisting that lunch isn't enough," she said without preamble. "They want to invite you to our house for dinner this weekend. Would that be something you'd be interested in?" Daniel looked around his apartment, trying to imagine himself in whatever kind of home Victoria Chen called residence. "Are you sure?" I mean, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to impose." "Mr. Chen," Victoria interrupted. "You saved my children's lives. You welcomed them into your home. When they needed safety and comfort, you gave them something precious. You made them feel cared for during one of the scariest experiences of their lives. A dinner invitation isn't an imposition. It's the beginning of what I hope will be a lasting friendship." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel found himself agreeing before he could second-guess the decision. As he hung up the phone, he realized that his life had shifted in ways he was only beginning to understand. The rescue had been instinctive, human, simple, but its consequences were proving to be anything but simple. Outside his window, fishing boats were returning from their morning runs, their holds hopefully full of the day's catch. Daniel should have been out there with them, adding to his meager income instead of playing host to rescued children. But as he watched the boats navigate the harbor, he realized he didn't regret missing a day of fishing. Some things were more important than money, even when money was desperately needed. What he didn't know was that Victoria Chen was at that moment sitting in her car, staring at her phone, and thinking about the man who had risked his own safety to save her children without expecting anything in return. The contrast between Daniel's selfless actions and the corporate world she inhabited was stark and unsettling. In her business dealings, every favor came with strings attached. Every gesture had an ulterior motive. But Daniel's rescue had been purely human, driven by nothing more than the recognition that children were in danger and needed help. As she drove north toward Palo Alto, Victoria found herself wondering about the man who lived above a fish market and made his living on an aging boat, but who had shown more courage and compassion in one morning than most of the wealthy executives she knew displayed in a lifetime. The Silicon Valley headquarters of Chen Dynamics occupied an entire city block in Palo Alto, its glass and steel architecture rising like a monument to technological ambition. Victoria Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 32nd floor, watching the morning traffic crawl along Highway 101 while her mind remained fixed on the conversation she'd had with Daniel 3 days earlier. The Prometheus merger documents spread across her conference table represented 18 months of negotiations and the kind of deal that would reshape the renewable energy landscape. Her company's breakthrough in quantum battery technology, combined with Prometheus Corporation's manufacturing capabilities, would create a clean energy empire worth an estimated $40 billion. The signing was scheduled for today, with media coverage, board presentations, and celebration dinners already arranged. Yet Victoria found herself thinking about a weathered fishing boat and the man who operated it with nothing more than skill, determination, and an unshakable moral compass. The contrast between Daniel's world and her own had been occupying her thoughts in ways that surprised her. She'd built her fortune by understanding systems, whether technological or human, but Daniel Chen represented something outside her usual calculations. Her assistant, Jennifer, knocked and entered with her usual efficiency. "The Prometheus team has arrived. They're setting up in Conference Room A. Legal wants to review the subsidiary agreements one more time, and the board is gathering for the pre-signing briefing." Victoria nodded, still looking out at the sprawling tech campus below. "Jennifer, what do you know about commercial fishing?" The question clearly caught her assistant off guard. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen?" "Commercial fishing. The business model, the economics, the challenges. I'm curious about how that industry operates." Jennifer's expression shifted to the focused attention she brought to any unusual request from her boss. "I could have research pull together a brief. Are you considering an investment in aquaculture? There have been some interesting developments in sustainable seafood production." "Something like that," Victoria said, turning back to face the room. "But make it comprehensive. I want to understand the financial pressures, the regulatory environment, everything." As Jennifer left to arrange the research, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom, you're still bringing Mr. Daniel to dinner Saturday, right? Lily's been practicing setting the table all week." The message made Victoria smile despite the mounting pressure of the day ahead. Her children had been talking about Daniel constantly since their rescue, incorporating him into their conversations and future plans with the easy acceptance that only kids could manage. They'd decided he was part of their family now, and in their minds, that settled the matter completely. The Prometheus signing proceeded with the kind of corporate choreography that Victoria had perfected over years of high-stakes negotiations. Presentations flowed seamlessly from market analysis to technical specifications to financial projections. The media captured carefully staged moments of handshakes and document signings, while lawyers ensured every detail was precisely documented. But throughout the ceremony, Victoria found her attention drifting to Daniel's upcoming visit. She'd given considerable thought to how to make him comfortable in her Palo Alto home, which suddenly seemed ostentatious when viewed through the eyes of someone who lived above a fish market. The indoor pool, the wine cellar, the staff quarters, it all felt excessive in a way she'd never considered before. The celebration lunch following the signing was held at an exclusive country club, complete with speeches about innovation, partnerships, and the future of clean energy. Victoria delivered her remarks with practiced charm, hitting all the expected notes about collaboration and market transformation. But as she spoke about building sustainable futures, she found herself thinking about Daniel's simple observation that people on the water looked out for each other. Dr. Robert Prometheus, the 70-year-old founder of the corporation that now bore his name, approached Victoria during the cocktail reception. Despite his age, he moved with the energy of someone half his years, his eyes sharp, with the intelligence that had built his manufacturing empire. "Quite a day, Victoria," he said, raising his champagne glass. "Your quantum battery technology is going to change everything. We're looking at the end of fossil fuel dominance within 2 decades. Victoria clinked glasses with him, but her smile felt forced. "It's certainly the beginning of something significant." Prometheus studied her with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people. "You seem distracted. Second thoughts about the merger?" "Not at all," Victoria replied quickly. "The partnership makes perfect sense from every angle. I was just thinking about implementation challenges." "Ah, the devil in the details," Prometheus nodded. "Though I suspect your mind is on something else entirely. You have the look of someone processing a paradigm shift." The observation was more accurate than Victoria cared to admit. Her worldview had indeed been shifting since the rescue, though she hadn't fully articulated the nature of that change to herself. Daniel's actions had reminded her of something she'd lost touch with in her climb to the top of the tech industry, the idea that some things mattered more than profit margins and market share. The afternoon board meeting focused on integrating the merger with Chen Dynamics' broader strategic vision. Victoria presented 5-year projections that showed exponential growth across every metric that mattered to investors. The numbers were impressive, even by Silicon Valley standards. But she found herself wondering what Daniel would think about the resources being deployed. Her head of operations, Michael Torres, raised a practical concern during the Q&A session. The manufacturing scale-up will require significant workforce expansion. "We're looking at potentially 15,000 new jobs across 3 states, but we'll need to be strategic about location selection. What criteria are you using for site selection?" Board member Sarah Kim asked. Torres pulled up a map showing potential locations. "Primary factors are infrastructure, workforce availability, tax incentives, and proximity to transportation hubs. We're looking at sites in Nevada, Texas, and North Carolina primarily." Victoria studied the map, noticing how all the proposed locations were inland, far from coastal communities that might benefit from new economic opportunities. What about California coastal areas? There are communities there with strong maritime traditions that might adapt well to manufacturing work. The comment drew surprised looks from several board members. Coastal California was expensive, heavily regulated, and generally avoided by manufacturing companies looking to maximize efficiency. "The regulatory environment would be challenging," Torres replied diplomatically. "And the cost structure doesn't align with our efficiency targets." Victoria nodded, accepting the logic while filing away the conversation for future consideration. As the meeting concluded, she realized she was looking forward to Saturday's dinner in a way that had nothing to do with business networking or social obligation. For the first time in years, she was genuinely curious about spending time with someone who operated by completely different rules. The drive down to Monterey Saturday morning gave Victoria time to decompress from the week's intensity. She'd left her security detail behind. Despite their protests, wanting to approach Daniel's world without the barriers that usually surrounded her. The Tesla's autopilot handled the highway navigation while she mentally prepared for an experience outside her usual social circles. The children chattered excitedly in the back seat, their enthusiasm infectious despite Victoria's underlying nervousness. They'd insisted on bringing gifts for Daniel, a coffee table book about fishing boats that Marcus had found, a hand-drawn picture from Lily, and a model sailboat that Ethan had built from a kit. "Do you think Mr. Daniel will like his presents?" Lily asked for the third time during the drive. "I think he'll love them because they came from you," Victoria replied, catching her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. "But remember, the most important gift we can give him is our appreciation for what he did." Monterey Bay sparkled in the afternoon sunlight as they approached the harbor. Victoria had made reservations at Pacific's Edge, one of the area's most acclaimed restaurants. But she'd also researched several more casual alternatives in case Daniel preferred something less formal. She was learning to navigate social situations where her usual advantages, wealth, corporate connections, exclusive venues, might actually be disadvantages. Daniel's apartment above the fish market looked different in daylight, smaller, but somehow more welcoming than she'd remembered. He answered the door wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt that had clearly been pressed for the occasion. His nervousness was obvious but endearing, and Victoria felt some of her own tension ease at his genuine smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, gesturing at the bustling fish market below. "Sorry about the aromatic ambiance." "Are you kidding?" Marcus replied before Victoria could respond. "It smells like adventure down there." The children immediately made themselves at home, showing Daniel their gifts and chattering about their week. Victoria watched the interaction with fascination, noting how Daniel gave each child his complete attention, asking thoughtful questions about their interests and activities. "I have something for you too," Daniel said, producing a small wooden box from his kitchen counter. "I made it this week." Inside the box were 3 small carved fish, each one unique and beautifully detailed. Daniel had clearly spent considerable time on the project, and the craftsmanship was remarkable. "They're beautiful," Victoria said, examining the delicate carving work. "You made these yourself?" "It's something I picked up during the slow fishing seasons," Daniel replied modestly. "Gives me something to do with my hands when the weather's too rough to go out." The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. Daniel proved to be an engaging conversationalist, sharing stories about life on the water that captivated the children while revealing an intelligence and perspective that impressed Victoria. He asked thoughtful questions about their lives, their interests, and their experiences, creating space for genuine connection rather than polite small talk. When Victoria mentioned the Prometheus merger, Daniel's response surprised her with its insight. "Sounds like you're trying to solve the energy problem from the supply side," he observed. "That's smart, but what about the demand side? Sometimes the best solutions come from using less rather than producing more." The comment sparked a conversation about sustainability, resource management, and the unintended consequences of technological progress. Victoria found herself sharing details about her work that she rarely discussed outside professional circles, while Daniel offered perspectives grounded in daily interaction with natural systems. "The ocean teaches you about balance," he explained as they walked along the harbor. "Take too much, and there's nothing left for tomorrow. Ignore the warning signs, and you end up in trouble fast. Everything's connected in ways that aren't always obvious until something goes wrong." As evening approached, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of going to Pacific's Edge, she suggested they pick up fish and chips from a local place Daniel recommended and eat on the beach. The children were delighted with the casual plan, and Daniel's relief was visible. They spread blankets on the sand as the sun began to set, creating an impromptu picnic that felt more authentic than any restaurant experience could have provided. The children played in the surf while Victoria and Daniel talked, their conversation ranging from practical matters like boat maintenance to deeper questions about purpose and meaning. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said as they watched the children build sandcastles. "When you decided to rescue them, what went through your mind?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I didn't really think about it. I heard kids were in trouble, and I had a boat that could help. Everything else was just details to figure out." "But you could have been hurt. Your boat could have been damaged. There were risks." "Sure," Daniel agreed. "But what was the alternative? Let someone else handle it and hope they got there in time. Some things are more important than protecting yourself." The simplicity of his moral framework stood in stark contrast to the complex risk-benefit analyses that dominated Victoria's professional world. In her business dealings, every decision was weighed against potential consequences, every action evaluated for its impact on shareholder value and competitive position. Daniel's willingness to act without calculating personal cost represented a different way of engaging with the world. As darkness fell and they prepared to head back to Palo Alto, the children extracted promises from Daniel to visit them soon and to teach them more about fishing and boats. Victoria found herself adding her own invitation for him to tour Chen Dynamics, though she wasn't entirely sure why she'd made the offer. The drive home was quiet, the children falling asleep in the back seat while Victoria processed the day's experiences. Daniel's world operated by rules she recognized but had gradually moved away from in her climb to corporate success. His values were clear and consistently applied, his priorities straightforward and deeply held. Most intriguingly, he seemed genuinely unimpressed by her wealth and status, treating her simply as the mother of children he'd helped, rather than as a powerful executive worthy of special deference. The experience was both refreshing and unsettling, forcing her to consider aspects of herself that had been submerged beneath years of corporate identity. As she pulled into her driveway in Palo Alto, Victoria realized that the day had shifted something fundamental in her perspective. The merger with Prometheus represented the culmination of everything she'd worked toward in her professional life. But her conversation with Daniel had introduced questions about what came next, about how to use success in ways that created meaning beyond financial returns. The Monday morning staff meeting at Chen Dynamics carried a different energy than usual. Victoria's assistant had prepared the research brief on commercial fishing that she'd requested, and the findings were sobering. The industry faced declining fish populations, increasing regulatory restrictions, aging infrastructure, and economic pressures that were forcing many independent operators out of business. The average income for commercial fishermen has declined by 30% over the past decade, Jennifer reported, reading from the executive summary. Equipment costs are rising, while catch limits are decreasing. Many fishing communities are experiencing significant economic distress. Victoria studied the data, thinking about Daniel's modest apartment and aging boat. The numbers gave context to what she'd observed during her visit. The careful way he managed resources, the makeshift repairs evident throughout his living space, the underlying tension that came from living on the economic margin. What about opportunities for economic diversification in these communities, she asked. Jennifer flipped through additional pages. Some coastal areas have had success with aquaculture, tourism, and renewable energy projects. There's also potential for manufacturing if transportation and workforce training challenges can be addressed. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Dr. Prometheus, who wanted to discuss implementation timelines for their joint venture. As Victoria handled the call, part of her mind remained focused on the fishing industry research and its implications for communities like Monterey. Victoria, I've been thinking about our conversation at the signing ceremony, Prometheus said. You mentioned paradigm shifts, and I'm curious about your thoughts on social responsibility as it relates to our new partnership. The question caught Victoria off guard. Prometheus had built his reputation on operational efficiency and market dominance, not social consciousness. What did you have in mind? Well, we're about to become one of the largest clean energy companies in the world. That comes with influence and responsibility beyond just shareholder returns. I'm wondering if we should be thinking more broadly about our impact on communities and individuals. Victoria found herself thinking about Daniel's observation that everything was connected in ways that weren't always obvious until something went wrong. Actually, I've been having similar thoughts. What if we looked at our site selection criteria differently? Instead of just optimizing for cost and efficiency, what if we prioritized economic development in communities that could really benefit from new opportunities? The conversation continued for 30 minutes, touching on topics that neither of them had seriously considered during the merger negotiations. By the end of the call, they'd agreed to convene a special task force to explore how their partnership could address broader social and economic challenges. As Victoria hung up, she realized that Daniel's influence was already extending beyond their personal interaction. His perspective on interconnectedness and community responsibility was beginning to inform her thinking about corporate strategy in ways she hadn't anticipated. The week progressed with a series of meetings and decisions that reflected Victoria's evolving priorities. She found herself asking different questions during strategic planning sessions, pushing her team to consider impacts beyond traditional business metrics. The changes were subtle but significant, representing a shift in how she approached leadership and decision-making. Thursday evening brought an unexpected call from Daniel. His voice carried an excitement she hadn't heard before, mixed with something that might have been nervousness. "Victoria, I hope I'm not bothering you, but something interesting has happened, and I wanted to share it with you." "Of course," she replied, settling into her home office chair. "What's going on?" "I got a call today from the Coast Guard. They want me to join their auxiliary training program as an instructor. Apparently, word got around about the rescue, and they think my approach could be valuable for teaching emergency response techniques." Victoria felt a surge of pride on his behalf. "Daniel, that's wonderful. You'd be perfect for something like that." "The thing is," Daniel continued, "it would mean regular travel up and down the coast, working with different stations and training new volunteers. It's an opportunity to make a real difference, but it would also mean stepping away from full-time fishing. How do you feel about that?" There was a pause before Daniel answered, excited and terrified in about equal measure. "It's a chance to do something that matters, but it's also a big change from everything I've known for the past 15 years. Victoria found herself offering encouragement while recognizing the parallel to her own recent experiences with paradigm shifts and new perspectives. Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as uncertainties. What does your gut tell you? "That it's worth the risk," Daniel replied. "Life's too short to play it safe when you have a chance to help people." After the call ended, Victoria sat in her office thinking about courage and the different forms it could take. Daniel was contemplating a career change that would reduce his financial security but increase his ability to serve others. She was beginning to question business strategies that maximized profit but might minimize human impact. Both of them were discovering that growth sometimes required leaving comfort zones and embracing uncertainty. The difference was that Daniel was making his choices based on values he'd held consistently for years, while Victoria was rediscovering values she'd set aside during her climb to success. Friday's board meeting included a presentation on the Prometheus Partnership's first quarter objectives. Victoria listened to discussions about production schedules, market penetration strategies, and competitive positioning while part of her mind remained focused on broader questions about purpose and impact. When the formal agenda concluded, she introduced the topic of community, engagement, and social responsibility. The response from board members was mixed, ranging from enthusiastic support to skeptical concerns about mission creep and shareholder obligations. "Our primary responsibility is to our investors," board member James Morrison pointed out. "We can't risk diluting our focus with social engineering projects." "I'm not suggesting we become a charity," Victoria replied. "I'm suggesting we think strategically about how our success can create value for multiple stakeholders, not just shareholders." The discussion continued for 40 minutes, touching on reputation management, stakeholder capitalism, and the evolving expectations for corporate leadership. By the end of the meeting, Victoria had gained approval to develop a comprehensive proposal for community-focused initiatives, though several board members remained skeptical. As the weekend approached, Victoria found herself looking forward to Daniel's upcoming visit to Chen Dynamics, with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business networking. She was curious about his reaction to her world, but more importantly, she was beginning to value his perspective on questions that traditional business advisors couldn't address. The contrast between their backgrounds and approaches had become a source of insight rather than discomfort. Daniel's straightforward moral framework provided a reference point for evaluating complex decisions, while his community-focused worldview offered alternatives to the individual achievement orientation that dominated Silicon Valley culture. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp air that made Northern California feel like the center of the world's possibilities. Victoria had arranged for Daniel to tour Chen Dynamics during regular business hours, wanting him to see the company in full operation rather than as a sterile weekend showcase. As she drove to meet him at the company's main entrance, Victoria realized she was nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her early days as an entrepreneur. Daniel's opinion mattered to her in ways that had nothing to do with business strategy or personal advancement. His approval couldn't advance her career or increase her net worth, but somehow it had become important to her in ways she was still learning to understand. The tour was scheduled to begin at 10, followed by lunch and a conversation about potential collaboration opportunities that Victoria had been developing throughout the week. As she pulled into the executive parking area, she saw Daniel's truck already waiting, its weathered appearance a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles that typically occupied the Chen Dynamics lot. The day ahead would test whether the connection they'd developed could survive the transition from Daniel's world to hers, and whether the values they'd discovered they shared could find expression in the corporate environment that had defined Victoria's adult life. The stakes felt higher than any merger negotiation or board presentation she'd ever faced, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Daniel stood outside the main entrance, studying the building's architecture with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. When he saw Victoria approaching, his smile was warm but carried an underlying nervousness that she recognized because she felt it too. "Ready to see how the other half lives?" she asked, gesturing toward the gleaming lobby beyond the glass doors. "Ready to learn something new," Daniel replied, his answer capturing exactly why she'd invited him and why his opinion had become so important to her. As they walked through the entrance together, Victoria realized that the day ahead represented more than just a tour or a social courtesy. It was an experiment in whether two very different worlds could find common ground, and whether success measured in different currencies could somehow add up to something larger than either could achieve alone. The lobby's polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, while digital displays showcased Chen Dynamics' latest innovations in sustainable technology. Daniel took it all in with the same methodical attention he'd applied to diagnosing the yacht's problems, observing not just what was visible but what the details revealed about priorities and values. The day's possibilities stretched ahead of them, filled with questions neither of them had asked before and answers that might reshape both their futures in ways they were only beginning to imagine. The quantum laboratory hummed with the quiet energy of scientific breakthrough as Victoria led Daniel through the heart of Chen Dynamics' research division. Banks of computers processed complex calculations, while technicians monitored battery prototypes that glowed with an ethereal blue light. The technology represented years of theoretical work translated into practical applications that would revolutionize energy storage. Daniel moved through the space with the focused attention of someone accustomed to understanding complex systems, asking questions that revealed both curiosity and genuine comprehension. His background in marine engineering provided an unexpected foundation for grasping the principles behind quantum battery technology, and Victoria found herself explaining concepts in ways she'd never articulated before. "The energy density is remarkable," Daniel observed, studying a prototype battery no larger than a smartphone that could power a house for a week. "But what happens when these reach end of life? Are they recyclable?" The question caught Victoria's Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Sarah Kim, off guard. Environmental impact hadn't been a primary consideration during the development phase, though it would obviously become important during mass production. "We're still researching sustainable disposal methods," Dr. Kim admitted. "The quantum materials present some unique challenges for traditional recycling processes." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "In fishing, we learned a long time ago that anything you put in the water eventually comes back to affect you somehow. Maybe the same principle applies to what you put into the energy grid." The observation sparked a 20-minute discussion about life cycle analysis, environmental responsibility, and the unintended consequences of technological advancement. Victoria watched her team engage with Daniel's questions, noting how his practical perspective challenged assumptions they'd accepted without examination. As they moved through the manufacturing floor, Daniel's attention was drawn to the workers operating the production equipment. He stopped to chat with several technicians, asking about their work processes and safety protocols with the genuine interest of someone who understood the value of skilled labor. "How long have you been with the company?" he asked Maria Santos, a production supervisor who'd been with Chen Dynamics for 8 years. "Since almost the beginning," Maria replied, clearly pleased by the attention. "It's been amazing to watch the technology evolve from prototypes to products that are actually changing the world." "What's the most challenging part of your job?" Daniel continued. Maria considered the question seriously. "Maintaining quality control when we're scaling up production so quickly. Every batch has to be perfect, but we're also under pressure to meet demand. It's like walking a tightrope sometimes." Victoria listened to the exchange with growing appreciation for Daniel's ability to connect with people across different backgrounds and roles. Her usual facility tours focused on impressive technology and strategic capabilities, but Daniel was more interested in the human elements that made the technology possible. The executive conference room overlooked Silicon Valley's sprawling landscape, providing a panoramic view of the tech industry's physical footprint. Victoria had arranged lunch to be served there, wanting to create an environment for serious conversation about potential collaboration opportunities. "I've been thinking about our discussion regarding community impact," Victoria began as they settled around the polished conference table. "What if Chen Dynamics could contribute to economic development in coastal communities like Monterey?" Daniel set down his water glass and leaned forward with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, you mentioned that the fishing industry is facing economic pressures. What if we could create manufacturing jobs that utilized existing maritime skills? Battery production requires precision work, attention to detail, and understanding of complex systems. Those are transferable skills." The idea had been developing in Victoria's mind since their Saturday dinner, but articulating it to Daniel made the possibilities feel more concrete. She pulled out a folder containing preliminary research her team had conducted on coastal manufacturing opportunities. "The logistics could be challenging," Daniel said, studying the documents. "Most fishing communities don't have the infrastructure for high-tech manufacturing." "True, but they have other advantages," Victoria replied. "Established transportation networks, available workforce, and local governments eager for economic development. What if we approached it as a partnership, rather than just a business expansion?" The conversation continued for 2 hours, touching on everything from workforce training programs to environmental impact mitigation. Daniel's insights into coastal community dynamics proved invaluable, while Victoria's understanding of technology transfer and business development provided a framework for turning ideas into actionable plans. By the end of lunch, they'd outlined a preliminary proposal for a pilot manufacturing facility in Monterey Bay, designed specifically to employ workers transitioning out of the declining fishing industry. The project would require significant investment and careful coordination with local stakeholders, but both of them were intrigued by its potential. "There's something else I want to show you," Victoria said as they prepared to leave the conference room. She led Daniel to a smaller office that served as her private workspace when she needed to escape the formal atmosphere of her main executive suite. The space was more personal than anywhere else Daniel had seen in the building, filled with family photos, technical drawings, and prototypes of products that had never made it to market. A large whiteboard covered one wall, filled with equations and diagrams in Victoria's distinctive handwriting. "This is where I actually work," she explained. "The big office is for meetings and presentations, but this is where I think." Daniel examined the whiteboard with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything else. The equations were beyond his understanding, but the thought processes they represented were familiar, the systematic approach to complex problems that he recognized from his own work. "You know," he said finally, "this reminds me of my workshop at home. Same kind of organized chaos, same focus on solving problems that haven't been solved before." Victoria felt a warmth at the comparison. Despite the vast differences in their work environments and resources, they shared a fundamental approach to challenges that transcended their specific fields. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer about the afternoon board meeting, reminding Victoria that the day's break from corporate routine was coming to an end. But she found herself reluctant to return to the formal structures that usually governed her time. "Would you be interested in sitting in on our board meeting?" she asked impulsively. "We're discussing the community development proposal, and your perspective could be valuable." Daniel looked surprised by the invitation. "I'm not sure I'd have much to contribute to a corporate board discussion." "Actually, you'd probably have more to contribute than most of the people in that room," Victoria replied. "They understand business strategy and financial modeling, but they don't understand the communities we're talking about serving." The boardroom was Chen Dynamics' most formal space designed to impress fresh and project corporate authority. 20 executive chairs surrounded a mahogany table that had cost more than Daniel's annual income, while wall-mounted displays provided real-time data on company performance and market conditions. Victoria's board members were already assembled when she and Daniel arrived, their expensive suits and polished presentations creating an atmosphere of refined power. She introduced Daniel simply as quote, a consultant on community development initiatives, without elaborating on their personal connection or the circumstances of their meeting. The meeting began with routine reports on financial performance, market positioning, and competitive analysis. Daniel listened quietly, taking notes in a small notebook he'd pulled from his shirt pocket. Victoria noticed that his observations focused on employment numbers, geographic distribution of operations, and environmental impact metrics, rather than the financial data that commanded most of the board's attention. When the discussion turned to the proposed Monterey Bay manufacturing facility, Daniel's presence became more significant. Board member Robert Chen, no relation to Victoria despite the shared surname, raised concerns about the project's economic viability. Coastal California manufacturing doesn't make sense from a cost perspective, he argued. We could achieve the same production capacity in Nevada or Texas for 30% less money. Victoria gestured to Daniel. I'd like to hear from someone who understands the local dynamics we're discussing. Daniel cleared his throat, clearly aware that every person in the room was worth more money than he would see in several lifetimes. But when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence that came from understanding his subject matter completely. Cost analysis is important, he began, but it's not the only factor worth considering. Monterey Bay has a workforce that understands precision work under pressure, people who've been maintaining complex equipment in harsh conditions for generations. That's not something you can train in a classroom. He paused, consulting his notebook. You're also looking at a community that's facing economic transition, whether you're involved or not. The fishing industry isn't going to recover to previous levels, so these workers are going to need new opportunities regardless. The question is whether you want to be part of creating those opportunities or just taking advantage of them. The room was quiet as board members processed this perspective. Daniel continued, his confidence growing as he found his rhythm. There's also the supply chain consideration. Half your component suppliers are in Northern California already. Moving production to Nevada or Texas means longer transportation distances, higher shipping costs, and more complex logistics. Sometimes the cheapest option on paper isn't the most efficient option in practice. Victoria watched the board members' faces as Daniel spoke, noting how his practical insights were shifting the tenor of the discussion. CFO Michael Torres was already pulling up transportation cost analyses on his tablet, while other members were asking questions about workforce training timelines and local government incentives. The conversation continued for 40 minutes, with Daniel fielding questions about everything from housing costs to educational infrastructure. His responses demonstrated a deep understanding of coastal community economics that none of the board members possessed, despite their impressive academic credentials and business experience. When the formal voting took place, the Monterey Bay project was approved by a margin of 8-2, with several board members specifically citing Daniel's insights as influential in their decision-making. As the meeting concluded, board member Sarah Kim approached Daniel with obvious curiosity. Your analysis of workforce capabilities was particularly compelling. Do you have a background in labor economics? Daniel smiled. I have a background in working with people who know how to get things done under difficult circumstances. Sometimes that's more valuable than theory. The drive back to Monterey that evening gave Victoria and Daniel time to process the day's events without the formal constraints of corporate environment. Victoria found herself more relaxed than she'd been in months, energized by the possibility of pursuing projects that created value beyond traditional financial metrics. I have to admit, Daniel said as they navigated the coastal highway, your world is more complicated than I expected, but also more interesting. I thought big corporations were just about making money, but there's real potential to make a difference. It's not always that way, Victoria replied honestly. Most of the time, it really is just about maximizing returns. But maybe it doesn't have to be. The conversation turned to implementation details for the Monterey Bay project, with both of them contributing ideas about workforce development, community engagement, and environmental stewardship. What had started as a theoretical discussion was evolving into a concrete plan with specific timelines and measurable objectives. As they reached Monterey, Victoria made a decision that surprised both of them. Instead of dropping Daniel off and returning to Palo Alto, she asked if he'd like to walk along the harbor and continue their conversation. The evening was clear and cool, with fishing boats returning from their day's work and pleasure craft settling into their slips for the night. The contrast with the corporate environment they'd left behind was stark but welcome. providing a reminder of the communities and values that had motivated their collaborative planning. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said as they walked along the waterfront. "What made you decide to trust me? When I first showed up at your apartment, you had every reason to be suspicious of my motives." Daniel considered the question while watching seagulls dive for fish scraps near the docks. "You could have just sent a check and a thank you note. That would have been the safe, conventional response. But you brought your kids to meet me personally, and you listened when they said they wanted to stay in touch. That told me something about your priorities." Victoria felt a warmth at his assessment, recognizing the truth in his observation. Her usual approach to problems was indeed to delegate implementation while focusing on strategic oversight. Her direct involvement with Daniel and her children's ongoing relationship with him represented a departure from her normal patterns. "Besides," Daniel continued with a smile, "your kids are pretty good judges of character. If they trusted you to make good decisions, I figured I could too." They found themselves at the same beach where they'd shared fish and chips the previous weekend, but this time the conversation carried a different weight. Instead of getting to know each other, they were planning a future that would intertwine their very different worlds in unprecedented ways. "The Monterey project is just the beginning," Victoria said, her voice carrying an excitement that had been building throughout the day. "What if we could create a model for technology companies to engage with traditional communities, not just as markets to exploit, but as partners to collaborate with?" Daniel picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the calm water, watching the ripples spread in expanding circles. "Every action creates reactions you can't always predict," he observed. "But sometimes you have to trust that the ripples will eventually reach where they need to go." The metaphor resonated with Victoria as she thought about the potential impact of their collaboration. Neither of them could predict all the consequences of bridging their different worlds, but both were willing to embrace the uncertainty in pursuit of something larger than their individual interests. As darkness fell and the harbor lights began to twinkle across the water, Victoria realized that her life had reached an inflection point that had nothing to do with corporate milestones or financial achievements. Her relationship with Daniel had introduced possibilities she'd never considered, not just for business development, but for personal fulfillment and social impact. 6 months later, the Monterey Bay Advanced Manufacturing Center held its grand opening ceremony on a bright October morning that seemed to embody the optimism of the project itself. The facility occupied a renovated warehouse near the harbor, its solar panels and wind turbines demonstrating the clean energy principles that guided its operations. Victoria stood at the podium addressing an audience that included local officials, Chen Dynamics employees, community leaders, and workers who had transitioned from fishing to manufacturing. The numbers were impressive. 60 new jobs created, local unemployment reduced by 12%, and production capacity that exceeded initial projections by 15%. But the statistics didn't capture the human stories that made the project meaningful. Maria Santos had relocated from Silicon Valley to serve as production manager, bringing her expertise while learning from local workers who understood precision and quality control in ways that couldn't be taught in classrooms. Tom Rodriguez, a 40-year veteran of commercial fishing, had become the facility's most skilled quality control technician, applying decades of experience with complex mechanical systems to quantum battery production. His suggestions for improving production efficiency had already resulted in 2 process improvements that were being implemented across Chen Dynamics' entire manufacturing network. Daniel stood near the back of the audience, wearing a new Coast Guard auxiliary instructor uniform that reflected his own career transition. His training programs had been so successful that the Coast Guard had asked him to develop a national curriculum for emergency response techniques, requiring travel across the country but providing opportunities to impact maritime safety on an unprecedented scale. As Victoria concluded her remarks, she spotted Daniel in the crowd and smiled. Their partnership had evolved beyond their initial rescue-based connection to encompass professional collaboration, personal friendship, and shared commitment to values that transcended traditional business metrics. The reception following the ceremony provided opportunities for less formal conversations about the project's broader implications. Dr. Prometheus had flown in from Phoenix specifically to observe the facility's operations, and his assessment was enthusiastic. "This model could be replicated anywhere we have manufacturing needs and established communities facing economic transition," he told Victoria as they toured the production floor. "It's not just good corporate citizenship, it's smart business strategy." The observation reflected a shift in thinking that Victoria had been promoting throughout Chen Dynamics and its partner companies. Social responsibility and business success weren't competing priorities, but complementary approaches to sustainable growth. As the day's events wound down, Victoria and Daniel found themselves alone on the facility's observation deck, looking out over Monterey Bay where their partnership had begun. The waters sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, dotted with fishing boats and pleasure craft that represented the community's diverse economy. "You know," Daniel said, leaning against the railing, "when I pulled those kids out of the water, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Victoria smiled, thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most important changes start with the simplest actions. You saw children in danger and decided to help. Everything else just followed from that. The simplicity of Daniel's original motivation continued to serve as a touchstone for their ongoing collaboration. Whether they were planning new manufacturing facilities, developing workforce training programs, or evaluating potential community partnerships, the question remained constant. Were they creating genuine value for the people most directly affected by their decisions? "What's next?" Daniel asked, a question that had become their unofficial motto for approaching new challenges. Victoria pulled out her phone and showed him a message that had arrived that morning from the governor's office. The state was interested in expanding the Monterey Bay model to other coastal communities facing economic transition, with potential funding for 5 additional facilities over the next 3 years. "We could help rebuild the entire coastal economy," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of possibilities she was still learning to envision. "Not just in California, but potentially along the entire Pacific coast." Daniel studied the message, his expression shifting between amazement and determination. "That's a lot of communities, a lot of families who could benefit from new opportunities. It's also a lot of responsibility," Victoria added. "We'd be taking on challenges that go way beyond manufacturing and technology development." "Good thing we've got experience with unexpected challenges," Daniel replied with a grin that reminded Victoria of their first meeting in his small apartment above the fish market. As evening approached and the reception officially concluded, Victoria faced a decision that had been building throughout the day. She could return to Palo Alto and her executive routine, treating the Monterey project as one successful initiative among many. Or she could embrace the transformation that her partnership with Daniel represented and commit fully to the new direction her life had taken. The choice wasn't difficult. Standing on the observation deck of a facility that wouldn't have existed without their collaboration, surrounded by evidence of what was possible when different worlds worked together, Victoria knew that her future lay in expanding this model rather than returning to her previous patterns. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised her with its intensity, "what would you think about making this partnership official? Not just for this project, but for everything we do going forward?" Daniel turned to look at her directly, reading the seriousness in her expression. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we create a new kind of company, one that's designed from the ground up to balance profit with social impact. We'd have the resources of Chen Dynamics behind us, but we'd operate independently, with our own priorities and decision-making authority." The idea had been developing in Victoria's mind for weeks, but articulating it to Daniel made the concept feel real and achievable. They could create something unprecedented, a business entity that measured success not just in financial returns, but in community development, environmental stewardship, and social innovation. "We'd be partners?" Daniel asked, his surprise evident but mixed with growing interest. "Equal partners," Victoria confirmed. "I bring the capital and technology expertise, you bring the community knowledge and practical wisdom. Together we bring something neither of us could achieve alone." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Victoria was proposing. The partnership would represent a complete departure from both their previous lives, requiring them to navigate uncharted territory with only their shared values as a guide. "You know," he said finally, "6 months ago I was just trying to make enough money to pay rent and keep my boat running. Now you're asking me to help run a company that could impact thousands of people's lives." "6 months ago, I was just trying to maximize shareholder value and expand market share," Victoria replied. "Now I'm asking you to help me figure out how business success can create lasting value for communities and families." The symmetry of their transformation wasn't lost on either of them. Both had discovered that their greatest satisfaction came not from personal achievement but from collaborative efforts that benefited others. Their partnership had revealed possibilities that neither had imagined when Daniel first responded to that emergency call on the water. As the sun set over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel extended his hand to Victoria. "Partners," he said simply, his grip firm and his smile genuine. "Partners." Victoria agreed, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with business deals or corporate milestones. Looking out over the water that had brought them together, they began planning a future that would honor both the practical wisdom of maritime communities and the innovative potential of modern technology. Their partnership represented more than just a business relationship. It embodied the possibility that different worlds could not only coexist, but create something larger and more meaningful together. The rescue that had started with 3 children in danger had evolved into something far more significant, a model for how individual actions could ripple outward to create systemic change, and how unlikely partnerships could generate solutions that neither participant could achieve alone. In the distance, fishing boats were heading out for the night shift, while the lights of the new manufacturing facility began to glow against the darkening sky. Old and new, tradition and innovation, individual courage and collective action, all of it woven together into a story that was just beginning to unfold. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.